Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome to Left Side of the Aisle. We've been gone a couple of weeks. We're glad to be back. My name is Larry Erickson, and for the next almost half hour, I'm going to be talking about some things that I think are interesting, I think are important and worthy of your notice. I hope you'll agree. If you have any comments, questions, or reactions, whatever, to the show, you can email them to me directly. My personal email is Whoviating, WHOVIATING @AOL.com. And if you can catch that, you can go to my website. It's called Lotus, Surviving a Dark Time, and the URL will be about here a couple of times during the show. And you can leave a comment there if you like, or you can get the email there if you missed it. If you do send me email, please include something in the subject line, make it clear this is about the show, it's not spam, and be a little patient about getting an answer because I'm absolutely lousy with email. So, with that out of the way, let's get to it. We're going to start, like I always like to when I can, with a little bit of good news. And this, I have to say, is not outstanding good news, but we can call it good news about the death penalty. Two recent Supreme Court rulings again tinkered with the machinery of death, in Justice Harry Blackmun's notable phrase, tinkered in ways that make it just a tiny bit harder for the hangman to get his coin. First, on May 23rd, the Supreme Court issued a 7-1 ruling, with only Justice Clarabelle Thomas dissenting, issued a ruling that made it clear that the court would not tolerate attempts for those who are trying to wriggle their way out of court-mandated protections for those accused of capital crimes. The case was Fisher v. Chapman, and it involved one Timothy Foster. In 1987, Foster, young, black, poor, and intellectually disabled, was convicted of the murder of an elderly white woman in rural Georgia by a jury that had been stripped by prosecutors of any potential black jurors. Now, this lack of black jurors allowed Foster's lawyers to call for what's called a Batson hearing, named for a Supreme Court case called Batson v. Kentucky. That case found that the use of race in jury selection was a violation of the rights both of the juror and the defendant. So at a Batson hearing, the prosecution can be called on to present race-neutral reasons for its preemptory challenges. And at this particular one, well, they did, or at least claimed to have done so. Because years later, it was discovered that the prosecution's trial notes for this case specifically identified potential jurors by race, going so far as to circle the word black in the jurors' form, marking the names of black jurors in green highlighter, and giving them code numbers. Now, despite this overwhelming evidence of racist intent, lawyers for the state of Georgia actually tried to argue before the Supreme Court that this was not evidence of bias. It was only intended to prepare a defense against a claim of bias. Now, if that sounds nuts to you, you're not alone. Even Chief Justice John Roberts, who's hardly some flaming lefty, called that argument nonsense. Now, the ruling doesn't overturn Foster's conviction, but it does mean he can apply for a new trial in front of a hopefully not racially biased jury, which means ultimately that if the Grim Reaper wants his shot at Timothy Foster, he's just going to have to wait a while. The other case arises out of Arizona, where Sean Patrick Lynch was on death row for a 2001 murder robbery. The legal ping pong within the Arizona court system and between Arizona and the Supreme Court is a little complex, but here's the nut of it. At the sentencing part of his trial, Lynch and his attorneys were specifically barred from telling the jury that if they chose life rather than death, that it would be life in prison without the possibility of parole. And they were banned from doing this, even as the prosecutors were telling the jury to consider Lynch's future dangerousness in making their decision. Now, and why was this okay, according to the state of Arizona? In an argument every bit as lame as Georgia's, they told the Supreme Court, in effect, that, well, someday in the future, the legislature might change the law, and which might allow him to get parole. So you see, he really is eligible for parole, so it was okay to keep him from telling the jury about what the law is. Nobody should buy that. The Supreme Court didn't. Only the Death Eaters Thomas and Sam Alito dissented. Again, this is not a major decision. It was on a relatively narrow point of law, and Jake Foster, which is also on a narrow point of law, probably won't have a major impact. But together, they do indicate a certain bit of reluctance to smooth the way to the abattoir, and that is good news. All right, but to keep things in balance, we have to have some not good news. And here it's the fact that something that doctors and other medical professionals have been fearing for some time has happened. A so-called superbug, resistant even to antibiotics of last resort, has been found in the United States. It was only a matter of time, of course, before such bacteria were found here, since it had already been found in China, Europe, and elsewhere. The thing is, strains of bacteria gain resistance to antibiotics in one of two ways. One of them is plain old evolution. Due to genetic variations, some bacteria are not killed by some antibiotic, and so they go on to reproduce until they are the dominant strain, and that strain of bacteria is now resistant to that antibiotic. Now, that doesn't mean, however, that other antibiotics would not work on that same strain of bacteria, and such resistance can only be carried within that bacteria's particular strain. But what can happen is that with the same family of bacteria, through that same process of evolution, can acquire resistance to the next antibiotic which is used against it. And so over time, you have families of bacteria resistant to a variety of antibiotics, which is why you can have what are called antibiotics of last resort, because nothing else works. The thing is, the other means for transferring resistance is through a plasmid. This is a small piece of DNA which carries a gene which is resistant, provides resistance to some antibiotic. Plasmids can make copies of themselves and transfer their genes not only to other bacteria within the same family, but they can actually jump to other families of bacteria, in effect, if you will, infecting them with resistance to that antibiotic. Now, so there's no need for evolution in here. The superbug just found in this case, a type of E. coli, has that type of gene. It's resistant to a drug called colistin, which is the antibiotic of last resort for a particularly dangerous type of superbugs, including a family known as carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae, or CRE for short, which health officials have dubbed nightmare bacteria because in some instances these infections have mortality rates of 50%. Half of the people who catch it die. Now, the particular strain of E. coli involved here is still treatable by other antibiotics, but the fear is that its resistance to colistin will spread through plasmids to other families of bacteria, which could result in there being an entire family of dangerous diseases for which there is no effective treatment. Now, I don't want to get too long or too complex, so let me cut to the chase here. What does all this mean in the final analysis? It means, in the words of Tom Frieden, who was the director of the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, quote, "The end of the road isn't far away for antibiotics," unquote. He said, "I've been there for TB patients. I've cared for patients for whom there were no drugs left. It's a feeling of horror and helplessness. This is not where we need to be." But the fact is, it's where we are headed. And damn it, we have, as in so many other ways, we have ourselves to blame for this. According to a new and major study, nearly a third of antibiotics prescribed in the United States are not needed. And many of them, most of them even, prescribed for conditions such as colds, sore throats, bronchitis, flu, and other illnesses which are caused by viruses, not bacteria, so antibiotics don't even work. But what such overprescribing does do is it increases the ability of bacteria to acquire resistance to antibiotics. And human use pales in comparison to the massive amounts of antibiotics routinely given to livestock, both here and abroad, in the pursuit of profits for agribusiness. We are headed for a situation where within a couple of decades, maybe sooner, people will be dying of diseases now curable, not because they lack effective access to medicine, but because there are no effective medicines for them to access. And it will be our own damn fault. All right, after that, I got to do something to brighten things up. So what I'm going to do is give out a hero award. That's something we give out here on occasion when the situation warrants it, to someone who just does the right thing on some matter, big or small. And this time the award goes to U.S. Representative Zoe Lofgren. During a House Judiciary Committee hearing on May 25th, Lofgren read aloud part of the testimony of Gail Harriet, who had testified that against the Obama administration's recent guidance for schools on how to provide for transgender students. This is quoting Harriet now. This is what Lofgren quoted. "If I believe that I'm a Russian princess, that doesn't make me a Russian princess, even if my friends and acquaintances are willing to indulge my fantasy. Nor am I a great horned owl just because I happen to share some personality traits with those feathered creatures." Now, Lofgren called that offensive, which I think is the least you can call it, as it equates being transgender with being insane and delusional. But Lofgren said she regretted that this was in the record. Harriet jumped in to try to say, well, the Obama administration's guidelines are what's offensive, but Lofgren would have none of it, and she said, this is the money quote, "I think you're a bigot, lady. I think you're an ignorant bigot." The committee chair told Lofgren that she was out of order. I think she was spot on, and a hero. All right, another thing is there are times when you figure you just got to laugh. There's no other response. This is one of those things where, you can't, you've said it, but you can't prove it because you didn't write it down anywhere, or in my case, didn't blog it. A while back, I was telling people that you could understand everything about Donald TheRump if you just bear in mind one fact. He's a real estate salesman. More recently, I've been saying to friends that I don't think TheRump wants to become president. Doesn't want to be president, rather. I think he just wants to become president. He just wants to see if he can make the ultimate score. Can he pitch himself to presidency? Well, this is what Paul Manafort, who is TheRump's current campaign chairman and chief strategist, had to say about what the great orange head is looking for in a vice president. This is quoting, "He needs an experienced person to do the part of the job he doesn't want to do. He sees himself more as the chairman of the board rather than the CEO, let alone the COO." So it appears I was even righter than I knew. Sometimes you just gotta laugh. And we're taking a break. And we are back. Okay, we are coming to the end of the presidential primaries. The last big ones are the end of this week on June 7th. I think there's a couple more primaries after that, but these are the last of the big ones. So I'm going to make one last comment on them. I've mentioned them a couple of times, I think twice, so this may be the last mention of them. And I want to do it because I want to focus attention on something that I think has not gotten enough attention, because it's really not part of the horse race aspect, not a part of, who's ahead, who's behind, whatever. We have to start by going back to the fact of the early April, and it was predicted that Hillary Clinton would win the Wisconsin primary. In fact, Nate Silver of 538.com gave Clinton a 98 or 99% chance, I forget which it was, but of winning the primary. That proved to be one of a string of bad predictions he has made this year, because not only did Bernie Sanders win the primary, he won it in a romp by 13.5 points. Now, in the wake of that primary election, the Clinton campaign realized that they could not ignore Sanders. They tried ignoring him. They had tried brushing him aside, gently dismissing his policies and whatnot, but they tried to treat him as a minor point. But now they realize that they couldn't do that. So they developed a 3-point strategy before the New York primary. Quoting, "Disqualify him, defeat him, and unify the party later." Now, the first part is what's mostly been ignored and what I wanted to talk about. Disqualify him. For the Clinton campaign and the Democratic Party establishment it represents, it's not enough to defeat Bernie Sanders. They have to disqualify him. It's not enough to win. They have to, and they want to, destroy his candidacy. They want to turn him into an irrelevancy, into someone not only who shouldn't be taken seriously as a presidential candidate, but doesn't deserve to be taken seriously as a presidential candidate. Because in Bernie Sanders' calls for a political revolution, they saw, correctly, a challenge to their control, a challenge to their power, a challenge to their privilege and position, and they want to crush that challenge as they have crushed previous such challenges in years past. Thing is, as I noted a few weeks ago, Bernie Sanders has said far more than once that his political revolution is not about him. It's about changing the nature and structure of power in our society, changing the structure of political, social, and economic power in our country. It's about going outside the political establishment to bring pressure on that establishment to get it to do what otherwise would not. Bernie Sanders is not the source or the purpose of that revolution. What he is now is the biggest symbol of it, the political epicenter of the hope, the fight, the drive for justice and a just society. And by crushing, by disqualifying his candidacy, that Democratic political establishment, that part of our economic, social, and political elite, hopes to disqualify the movement that he represents. Now, they couldn't do that openly, of course. Oh, no, not after Wisconsin showed that movement's potential and the power that it could have, and not when they still hope to get the support of Sanders voters in the general election, and not when, reports have it, the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, is drooling over the notion of getting access to Sanders' list of campaign contributors. So instead, they whined and groused and grumped about Sanders' tone, about how his about how the behavior of him in his campaign was destructive, about how he wouldn't debate him unless he changed his tone, and about how if he didn't tone it down, well then, in the words of some anonymous senior Clinton aide, F him. And of course he spelled out the F, which I can't do here. And if you haven't figured it out already, what was wrong with his tone is that he was criticizing Hillary Clinton. Which means, in turn, that officially, the campaign officially, was quite content to have Sanders continue to campaign, leaving it to their surrogates and supporters all the sneering and screeching and sniping about how he's a loser who should, as I said a few weeks ago, concede, withdraw, and on bended knee kiss the ring and swear fealty to all things Clinton, forgetting all about this political revolution nonsense and devoting himself to upholding the status quo. But officially, the campaign is fine with him campaigning right through the convention, right into the convention, as long as he watches his tone. That is, as long as he avoids criticizing Clinton, as long as he allows her to skate into the nomination without further opposition, as long as he allows her to treat him as a cute irrelevancy, and assume that in the general election, every Sanders voter is hers by right rather than something she has to earn. In other words, so long as he doesn't impact the power and position of that political establishment. Meanwhile, the attacks on, and here's something, by the way, a lot of the faux outrage about Sanders' tone has been along the lines of, he's attacking Clinton's character. These are character attacks. So if the Sanders campaign or any of his supporters point out the troubling fact that 80% of the $76 million her super PAC has raised have come from just 20 donors, that, according to the Clintonistas, is a character attack. The Sanders campaign refers to the reality that the so-called Hillary Victory Fund has acted essentially as a money laundering scheme to get around limits on campaign contributions. Well, according to them, that's a character attack. If the Sanders campaign notes how her campaign is openly coordinating with a super PAC called Correct the Record, coordination which is supposed to be illegal, but which they are justifying by an underhanded and quite possibly bogus interpretation of the law, coupled with the fact that the Federal Election Commission is incapable of enforcing the law because of a paralyzing partisan divide among its members, will point that out, and that's a character attack. mentioned that she has made millions of dollars giving speeches to big banks and Wall Street and has not released the transcripts of those speeches, even as her own absurd conditions for doing so have been met, and you get told that's a character attack. Well, frankly, bull. Those aren't character attacks. Those are objective facts. You want a character attack? Okay. How about when Bernie Sanders was labeled a racist because he said that no Democratic candidate was going to carry the Deep South? How about when he was declared a sexist because he said, "Let me finish," to Clinton during a debate after she kept interrupting him? Those are character attacks. You want a more recent example? I'll give you one. May 24th edition of The Hill, Markos Moulitsas, who is the founder and director of the big website Daily Kos, called Sanders a hypocrite and an old-school autocrat for trying to win the support of superdelegates in the Democratic Convention. He called that effort a socialist coup driven by white privilege, which is an elegant way of calling it racist, marked by astonishing arrogance and lack of awareness that in fact was an attempt to disenfranchise the party's voters, and suggested that Sanders was threatening to destroy the party if he doesn't get his way. That's a character attack. And it's not just Sanders. His supporters are getting the same treatment. Consider last week, a writer named Rebecca Bohannon essentially argued that support for Bernie Sanders is due to sexism, that his support is among straight white males and they support him because they can't stomach the idea of supporting a woman. Her argument was summed up early in her piece with this quote, "Do you personally know even one straight white man backing Clinton in this election?" Actually, yes, I do. But leaving that aside, women supporting Sanders, people of color supporting Sanders, LGBTQ people supporting Sanders, all are rendered invisible in Rebecca Bohannon's world. Even the fact that the one clearest divide between Clinton supporters and Sanders supporters is not race, is not gender, it's age. That's irrelevant. It's completely ignored. It's wished out of existence. So desperate is she to uphold this nonsense that she even says Gloria Steinem was right when she said that young women are only supporting Sanders, and this is a quote, because that's where the boys are. Oh, wait, no, that's not completely fair. She admits that back in the 2008 primaries, Clinton won white men by double digits over Barack Obama. Oh, but never mind. According to her, that just means those white men who supported Clinton in 2008 were racists. Apparently, they were just more racist than they were sexist. So it means if you support Sanders, you're either a straight white male and therefore a sexist and possibly a racist and probably both, or you're a young woman too immature or stupid to recognize sexism even when it smacks you in the face. That's a character attack. Getting back to Moulitsas, in that same piece sliming Sanders, he brings up the bullcrap about what happened at the Nevada convention. According to Moulitsas, Sanders delegates nearly rioted in anger because they were thwarted in their attempts to get more delegates than they deserved. According to the conventional wisdom of the event, which he was happy to cite and parrot, supporters rushed the stage, chairs were thrown, there was utter chaos, and Senator Barbara Boxer said she feared for her safety, which in some reports got escalated to feared for her life. And Sanders, we were told, shrugged it all off. Now, what's most important here is that Moulitsas was writing days after that conventional wisdom was shown to be bullcrap. In hours of video from multiple sources, there is not a shred of evidence backing up what's been claimed. There was a lot of shouting and there was some name calling, but there was no violence. There were no chairs thrown. There was no rushing of the stage. And Barbara Boxer was so worried about her safety that she is seen in video taunting the people in the crowd who are angry by blowing them phony kisses as she left. None of that, apparently, was of concern to Markos Moulitsas, apparently because it didn't serve the end of disqualifying Bernie Sanders by disqualifying his supporters. Which brings me back to the original point. This isn't about defeating Sanders, especially not to hear the Clintonistas say it. He's already been defeated. She's already won. To listen to them. It's about disqualifying him, disqualifying his supporters, and behind it all, disqualifying the political revolution that he had hoped to build. That's what this is about, and we must never, ever forget it. This revolution, again, the revolution we talk about is not about Bernie Sanders. It's about change. And the reaction we're seeing now from the elites is not about Bernie Sanders. It's about undermining that drive for change. So come what may, we have to carry on. In that same piece a few weeks ago that I mentioned, I said that in advancing that political revolution, we have to be loud, noisy, disruptive, but most of all creative. We have to be impolite, rude to power. And we have to not care what they call us, because they will call us all sorts of things. And they will add here, they're already starting. To which there could only be one answer: carry it on. All right, I have a footnote to that to wrap up for the day, just in case you're indulging in the fantasy that the media would act as a counterbalance to the party's establishment's thumb on the scales. Let me disabuse you of that false notion. The media watchdog group FAIR did an analysis of all 9 Democratic debates over the past 7 months. They found that 30 questions are asked about ISIS or Islamic terrorism, even though since 2001, and this is quite literally true, Americans are as likely to be killed by having unstable furniture fall on them as they are to be killed by Islamic terrorism. 11 questions are asked about Russia, 10 questions are asked about socialism or communism, all of them directed to Bernie Sanders. In 9 debates, there was not one question about poverty. The candidates themselves did bring it up. Clinton did so 5 times. Sanders did it 12 times, but not one question addressed it. According to the 2014 census, 14.5% of Americans, some 45 million people, live in poverty. That's up from 11.5% in 2000. But according to the gatekeepers of our democracy and the media, it wasn't worth asking about. An estimated 16 million Americans under the age of 18 live in poverty, but it wasn't worth asking about. A 2011 study attributed 133,000 deaths a year to poverty-related illnesses. Poverty has been linked to diminished IQ in children in the United States and has been shown to impact economic gains, overall health, and quality of life. But apparently it wasn't worth asking about. Americans are literally 1 million times more likely to live in poverty than to have been killed by jihadi terror since 9/11. But the masters of our mainstream media decided it wasn't worth asking about. I have said I don't know how many times that we are uninformed, malinformed, and misinformed by our major mainstream media. The beat goes on. These people are not on your side. That's it for this week. Glad to actually be back after our time off. We will see you next week with more blathering on about things that are of importance. In the meantime, as always, you have the best week you possibly can, and peace.